Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're broadcasting from tonight. Pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. I'm Tegan Taylor. I'm a journalist with ABC Radio National, and I am your host and moderator for this series. In December, Australia's federal government will enforce a social media ban for under 16s. But how will this ban be enforced? Will its impact live up to community expectations? And how should parents, carers and educators be talking to kids about this change? These are some of the burning questions you submitted to us prior to tonight's discussion. Lucky for you, I am joined by experts who will unpack this major new legislation and what it will mean for social media culture and digital connectivity among young people. Before we start, a reminder, you can be part of the discussion by asking questions using the Q&A box on your screen. To kick off, I'd like to introduce our panel. Joining me in the studio are Professor Nicholas Carra, Director of the Centre for Digital Cultures and Societies and a Professor in UQ's School of Communication and Arts. Professor Carra's research examines the algorithms and participatory advertising model of digital media platforms. Professor Alina Moravska is Director of the Parenting and Family Support Centre and a Professor in Family Psychology and Parenting. Professor Moravska's research focuses on the central role of parents in influencing all aspects of children's development. And Associate Professor Garth Stahl, an affiliate of the Centre for Digital Cultures and Societies and an Associate Professor at UQ's School of Education. Associate Professor Stahl's research interest focuses on the relationship between education and society, identities and social change. All right, let's get into it. I think we should start with a bit of some definitions. Nick, what is the ban?
The ban is, the E-Safety Commission are very particular. It's not a ban on young people.
It's a delay.
It's a delay, and it's a requirement that digital platforms don't allow under 16s to create and maintain an account. And that's what's being banned. So from there, on December 10, whether you want to access one of these platforms, if you can do it without an account, well, you'll be able to do all that stuff still. But anything you need an account for, you'll need to somehow verify or assure the platform that you're over 16.
Alina, can you kind of remind us the origin story of this ban? What were we trying to protect kids from?
I think it's probably a fairly complicated story with multiple strands to it, but I think social media, digital devices, screens are a problem for our parents' number one concern in this country. And as a public health issue, we're concerned about the role of social media in things like mental health, also issues around radicalisation, the sort of risky content that kids and adolescents and young people can get into. So all of those things were considered reasons for trying to protect children from the harms associated with social media.
It feels like its sort of scope has expanded over the course of the discussion period. Is this something that you've noticed?
I think, one of the advantages of the ban, I think, is that it has brought the conversation about social media to the forefront and what it means. And in some ways, while social media is everywhere now, it's ubiquitous, it's actually still pretty new from a research perspective. So research is still catching up with the effects of social media. So I think the reason we're hearing a lot more about the effects of social media is simply because research is catching up, especially longitudinal research that can track the effects of it over time.
Garth, you've done some research, not the definitive research, but you have looked at how kids use social media now.
Yeah, and thank you for that. So I think just building on your point that you mentioned there, I think it's really important that we are having a productive conversation about this where lots of varying viewpoints have been brought to the fore in a variety of different ways. In terms of the empirical research that I've done, it's been particularly around how young people engage with social media to look at other young people and their activist efforts and around it. And I think and these young people would all be under the age of 16. And I guess that was just an interesting sort of research because when you think about the way that your own sort of political values are shaped over time, we can pinpoint definitive moments in our lives that shaped our political values. And for these young people, their political values were largely shaped by their access to social media, also in conversation with other things, their parents, their formal schooling, and things like that.
Political viewpoints aren't really an anxiety here, though, in the same way as like being groomed by people, like by adults when your child is underaged, or being bullied online. Those are the sorts of anxieties that I'm hearing in the narrative at the moment. How much is the political part of it, and how much is it those other things?
Yeah, I'm not saying that. It's an interesting point to make, because I'm not saying that necessarily they didn't feel social pressures around the activism they encountered. So what I sort of saw in my research was that they're spending a lot of time online, they're accessing a variety of social media platforms, and content creators or activists are accessing that as well. They're getting a wide variety of opinions, and then this adds an additional pressure to their lives. And in their additional pressure to their lives, they feel the need or compelled to have an opinion on a current event topic, where it's, the conflict in Gaza, whatever it is, particularly climate change, whatever these sort of topics are. So actually it does build an additional layer of pressure for them, which now this research was conducted prior, obviously, to the ban.
One of the things that's been really interesting, Nick, is the discussion around, you're like, we should ban social media to protect kids. And you're like, yeah, cool, let's do that. And then you're like, what's social media? Where does the definition lie? One of the questions we got a lot in the lead up to today's discussion was about Roblox and why it wasn't part of the ban. And then today that changed. How do you even define the box that we're putting these apps into?
I mean, there's a really particular definition, but nothing fits in it properly anymore. I think the events with Roblox today is effectively Roblox coming in and saying, okay, we're going to introduce some age assurance and verification in using our platform. And it's almost like because they're currently outside the ban, they're not considered social media, but a lot of the things that we're concerned about on, say, social media platforms are definitely happening on Roblox, maybe even maybe Roblox is one of the more dangerous places in some respects. And so it's interesting that the ban's kind of had this sort of knock-on effect where Roblox has gone, oh, wait a second, maybe we need to kind of preemptively be seen to be taking some more responsibility here. So I think while the ban is narrowly framed around social media, maybe you'll see this kind of ripple where in kids, like the larger digital ecosystem for kids, platforms are going to sort of start to preemptively or, introduce more measures, in effect, because they don't want to become formally subject, I think, to the ban. But then I think the other thing about what social media is, like, this intense lobbying from YouTube and TikTok through this whole consultation period where in various ways they tried to make the argument that they aren't social media. And YouTube was outside for a long time, and TikTok was saying, well, if they're outside, we should be outside, And so, because social media now really is, most social media platforms are also these big kind of entertainment short video platforms. That's almost like primarily what they are. And those two things are kind of impossible to disentangle, the kind of social networking bit from the sort of like, almost like what television is for kids now, The
other thing that's really hard to untangle is the jurisdiction. We're talking about one little country, Australia, against social media companies that are largely based elsewhere. One of the phrases I've heard used around this ban in Australia from Australians is that it's world leading. We're leading the world. Garth, Alina, what do you make of that characterisation?
Well, we're not, would be the most obvious thing, because this has been trialed in other countries, particularly, but I guess sort of linking back to the point that was previously made is that we don't know what the results are. It's too early to say what those results would be from those other countries. So therefore it's hard to make sort of conjectures about what would occur here. And there's also been different age ranges as well, right? So, 16 is the age we're going with here in Australia, but I believe it's 14 in Denmark or something. Don't quote me on it, but something along those lines.
Alina?
Yeah, look, I think everybody's watching what we're doing and how effective it's going to be, because I think that's one of the big pieces of conversation is, well, if social media is harmful, then presumably reducing kids' access to social media should reduce some of those harms. And we don't have any research evidence around whether that is or isn't going to happen. A parallel is probably around schools banning smartphones in classrooms. And again, it's still a very, very new area. And there is now emerging research around the world suggesting that in fact banning phones in school does have positive effects on academic outcomes, on well-being, on peer pressure. So it's evolving, so it's still pretty early days, but that's where the research seems to be pointing that it is effective. So perhaps the social media ban will also have those kinds of effects, but we won't know for some time.
How will we measure it?
Well, that's an excellent question, because we're not really tying specifically, we're saying we've got a mental health crisis in young people, but there's no direct tie back to social media at this stage. So it's a whole bunch of metrics that could be applied around well-being in general, academic outcomes, bullying, exposure to inappropriate content.
So when we take kids out of the mix, the internet's going to be different. I want to talk a bit about what that looks like. Maybe firstly from a social point of view, Garth, what does, if the young people aren't on social media sites anymore, what's my experience going to be like?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think within that is also the fact that, use the term ubiquitous nature of social media in our lives or whatever, and I would say that's an interesting point to pick up on, the fact that we're all spending an incredible amount of screen time on social media, and that you can stumble across stuff that you're not even intending to go in that particular way. And I think we'll talk about algorithms in a second, though. And I think, and I'd be curious to know your point of view on the parenting aspect around it, because there has been sort of, I wouldn't say research, but I would say conjectures around that parents spend significant amount of time on their phones, and this might alter the way they parent young people. I don't have any data, I'm just saying.
Luckily, right?
Luckily I'm here. The data is pretty clear that for screen time in general, but also for social media use, the amount that the parent engages in is mirrored in their child. So more parent use, more child use, less parent use, less child use. There is also research amongst parents of babies that shows this kind of concept of technoference, where their parent is paying attention to their phone rather than to their baby, and that potentially then has impacts on the developing parent-child bond and relationship.
What if you're looking at photos of your baby on your phone? Because that's what I spent a lot of time doing when I had young babies.
Yeah. And look, I guess it comes back to, I always say screens themselves and social media are neither good nor bad in and of themselves. It's how you're using them and what for and under what circumstances. And it's the same for adults and kids. We're not going to suddenly stop because it's impossible in our society to do that. So we really need to be thinking about, well, what does healthy screen use, what does healthy screen social media use look like? And to me, it's when it's purposeful, so you've got a reason for doing, you've thought through that reason, but it's also responsible, I guess, balanced and probably limited. We probably all spend too much time on our devices and not enough time in the real world.
Nick, it's also going to change not just social media, but like the whole internet.
It's like we'll wake up on December 10 and like under 16s will be banned from social media, but the rest of us will discover that it's a big change for us too, because we're living in like a verified internet all of a sudden, where increasingly to use like a whole range of digital platforms and services, we're going to have to say who we are and be identified somehow. And I don't think it's fully clear what like norms will develop in Australia over time. Like, will we have to like scan our face? Will it look at our history of the use of other services? Like, we'll be able to use our Google login, and if we've been on YouTube for 16 years, it'll assume we must be over 16, and Google will pass that through to whatever other service. Do you know, like, so what's this going to look like? But we're all going to have to like prove who we are when we show up. And for a lot of us, we'll realize that we've been using a lot of digital services and platforms kind of anonymously. You know, we're creating a little profile maybe where we don't say much about who we are. We certainly have to tell it who our real name is, or we don't have to show our face or whatever. And I think a lot of us will start to feel a little bit uneasy about that change. And I think it might affect some of the ways in which we use some of these services as well. So it's kind of a big shift. And it's a big shift too because of all the, the concern about our personal information on the web and recognition about increasingly sort of how vulnerable that information is as it starts to circulate in all sorts of directions, you know.
I feel like there's already a lot of anxiety about how identifiable we are from our metadata.
Right.
And you're saying that's going to be ratcheted up even more.
Yeah, because like, it's that feeling of like everything you do on a social media platform now will be like, in a sense, connected back to your real identity. And a lot of us will feel a little bit weird about that, you know, like, and some of us might have good reason actually to feel significantly uncomfortable about it. Like if there are things about our lives or ourselves that are kind of we consider intimate and private and we don't want connected with our real name identity, and there are plenty of legitimate reasons for that in someone's life. Like it's not always, you know, dodgy or problematic things. You know, there's plenty of things about ourselves that are intimate and private. And once upon a time in our culture, you know, you could go off to the library and take out a book and no one had to know. You know what I mean? Like you could do things and no one had to know. But so this feeling with a lot of things we're consuming, a lot of social networks and groups we're joining, like that's connected back to a profile, that's connected back to a photo of my face or some identifying information about me. And so I think that's a significant change, and like it's underappreciated that that's the world we're heading into post December 10. And increasingly, I think globally, it's you know, it's like this big question of we're kind of ending the era, if you like, of the sort of anonymous internet and moving into an era of a kind of fully verified internet where everyone's kind of identified and trackable all the time. Like that's a new sort of world to live in.
Garth, I can see you nodding there. What's going through your mind as you're hearing you describe that?
As you were saying that, I was just thinking of, you know, countries where there have been significant bans or restrictions around technology use, full stop or whatever, and all the like workarounds within those particular aspects. And they're just, you know, whether it's VPNs or I'm sure there are other examples as well. I just think that's interesting to consider that you have this regulation, you know, and then, yeah, the workarounds within that. Or, yeah, I think we're going to see young people being very agentic in creative ways in the coming weeks. And I think I'm intrigued to see how that unfolds.
I love it. It's sort of like this glee of like, I wonder what they'll do.
And I think there's like, you know, like some of the stuff that like Britain bring in a kind of verification step for accessing pornography. And one of the things you're seeing immediately is this huge drop off in the use of pornography in Britain in the last few months. And, you know, like you might step back from a kind of moral or social point of view and say, well, that's, you know, that's a good thing, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, if someone is like, I don't know, like a sexually or gender diverse person and they're using social media to access groups where they talk about their identity, they access information and whatever, and they feel because they're anonymous, they have a degree of privacy and intimacy around that, then that's like a good thing. And if now on December 11, they need to verify who they are to kind of access those groups or those
kind
social
of no matter
worlds,
how old they are.
No matter how old they are, they might be like, oh, I don't want to do that. And it's like, and then I think, you know, there'll be lots of little moments like that where we'll go, oh, wait a second, like my privacy, my anonymity on the internet sort of mattered to me, do you know?
But like the egg hasn't been scrambled yet, but it's like cracked. It's
right,
a bad
right.
analogy.
Like it's cracked
we're
and
already
the pan
here.
is on.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
you know, this is going to happen. And I think like, we keep talking about, oh, we're banning the kids from the internet. And it's like the rest of us are going to realize that like to ban the kids from the internet, the rest of us are going to have to show our ID at the door, do you know? Yeah. And I think we'll be a little bit surprised. Do you know, like, I mean, I was in the Valley this, like for a thing during the week and I got asked my ID and I was a bit like, what, like me? Like, I don't need to show my ID. Like, do you know? Yeah, look at you know, like I've got 2 kids. Like, do you know? But it'll be like that for all of us. Like we'll be asked for our ID and I think a lot of us will be a little bit put out about that, do you know? Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing is, just sort of the conversations we have to have when it's time. When it's time for kids to be like, oh, I'm 16 now, like, give me the internet key, I guess. Alina, how do we prepare our kids for that day?
I think the important thing is not to consider as preparing kids for that day. Because if parents think of it that way, then there's this huge number of things that they'll need to do the day before, right? So to me, it's always about an ongoing conversation between parents and kids about the technology, but also helping kids to develop the skills they'll need to manage it safely. Right, so I guess if you think about driving as an analogy, it's not like when they turn 16 and a half or whatever it is, we give them the keys and say, go, right? We take them through a whole process of learning and skill building before they're able to do it independently. And I think we should view the use of technology, devices, social media, AI, all of the things that are here now and into the future in the same way, that kids aren't going to suddenly develop the skills on the day they turn 16. They'll need skill building before that. And probably parents will need skill building before that too.
Yeah, I was just going to extend on that point you just mentioned there, because I think, you know, there's a lot of evidence out there that educators, particularly educators in schools, they don't feel they have the requisite knowledge to impart those skills in a productive and constructive way, and or they don't feel empowered to do so because it has become such a contentious and divisive issue in many communities. So I think that is part of the equation in and around it. And I guess obviously I'll be really interested to see this once the ban is brought in, like what is the influence or impact in around schools? I mean, obviously we already have bans in place in many schools across states and territories here in Australia, but I think there'll be other things that haven't occurred to us that there'll be positive, like different sorts of knock-on effects.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say that teachers or educators don't necessarily feel confident. We've done a little bit of work asking preteens, so 10 to 13-year-olds, and some of the things that they were telling us were things like, well, they do teach us at school about this kind of thing, and maybe neither teachers nor parents are the greatest educators around this because they don't actually know the stuff. Yeah. So when you say VPN, lots of parents won't know that, lots of teachers won't know that. So their viewpoint was, well, maybe you need to get experts who actually know about this to teach us so it feels authentic and real.
And I think teachers have been, if you're interacting with young people in a school the last 10 years or whatever, you've become familiar with the range of platforms kids are using and the sort of things that are happening and how that's spilling over. And it's what's going to be really interesting next year is over summer, kids are going to figure out all these amazing other places to do all the crazy stuff they want to do. And I just figure term one next year is going to be teachers going what is that? How did this happen? Explain, it's going to be kind of relearning the internet, except this time around it's not going to be 3 or 4 major platforms. It's going to be all these kind of amazing places kids go to build little social networks, chat to each other, share information, do all the things they've been doing that's been causing this all sorts of issues in schools. And we're not super prepared for that, I don't think. It's not like these are the only places kids can go. So they're going to have a very fun summer, I think, on the internet in Australia, working out, how to reconstruct their own digital cultures,
I think there are fantastic resources out there in the realm of e-safety. Mm-hmm. I think the challenge for e-safety education is what we just highlighted, and the fact that it changes so quickly. It's across multiple platforms. You can't expect an educator to be an expert in all of these particular areas. So I think it's just a very challenging field. And I think, there's many examples of people who have the best intentions, but these challenges are difficult to negotiate.
Are there enough resources for parents and for educators? It really feels like the vibe that I'm getting is that the ban is sort of one piece, and then around it needs to be these layers of how do you have these conversations as a parent? What do you do when your kids are preteen and early teen? What do you do when they're approaching 16? How do you check in with them once they're out there? Alina, what currently exists and what would you like to see?
Mm-hmm. Look, I think, as I said before, the ban has opened up a really important conversation around this, but I think it's only one part of the puzzle, and we really need to be upskilling teachers, educators about it. We need to be upskilling parents about these kinds of conversations, and we need to be putting effective skills into the hands of kids as well. Now, the eSafety Commissioner does have a whole bunch of resources on their website. There are obviously other evidence-based parenting programs, such as Triple P, for example, that assist parents with these kinds of topics. But we still don't have a lot of parents accessing that kind of information.
One of the really interesting resources that you're seeing going around at the moment, I think this is kind of important and interesting and says something about what's going to happen, but it's resources telling kids under 16 how to download a copy of their account before December 10. Yeah. And I just have this feeling like I hope kids understand that, because a lot of them are at risk of losing their account. And with it, they might lose all of their photos or all of their social networks, all of that. Now, platforms allow you to download a copy of that. And I think for a lot of young people, that's an important part of their life. And so I think, how many parents are ready to support their kid to download and archive their social media account because of this thing the government's about to do? There's lots of complexities here and new things. Whoever would have thought about having to download and archive your social media account because you're about to be locked out of it.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up a point of what I'd like to see a little bit more of, not discounting the quality of the eSafety resources. Two things spring to mind. I think the emotional and the affective element of social media, because people speak about it in the same language they speak about an addiction and a withdrawal, and those two things seem like I haven't seen that represented in e-safety education, particularly around that sort of, you hear the notion of the dopamine hit and stuff like that, but I think there's a lot more complexity in around that, and I would like to see that as a integral part of e-safety education. And then I think obviously also the elephant in the room is the fact that these big tech companies are being held to account, and I think young people do perhaps have algorithmic awareness around things, but I don't think they often understand the capitalist nature, what the world looked like before we had big tech. And I think part of our duty of care around e-safety education is to say, well, there is a big ecosystem right here, and I think young people would benefit from hearing that in a formal educational context.
Speaking of duty of care, one of the criticisms of the ban is that we shouldn't be locking kids out, we should be making the internet a safer place. Are we letting companies wash their hands of that if we take this route instead?
I think that's the huge risk with the ban. It's a kind of regressive step in the sense of you're rather than imagine what good digital cultures look like, rather than coming up with a kind of positive duty of care that platforms should have to young people, or a positive sense of children's own digital rights. You're just banning them from a digital world that's actually become really important to them. And and in doing that, I think you're possibly creating a situation where these super powerful commercial platforms that's a part of the market we don't get access to until they turn 16 in that part of the world, whatever. And government will think, well, we banned the kids from social media, so that's that problem solved, and it's like, is that going to set us back actually a long way in terms of the work that we are eventually going to need to get to, which is, what duty do these platforms have to us as a society, because they're so fundamental to our public culture, and what are the digital rights of our kids? And if you talk to our kids, they tell you all sorts of things about their sense of the importance of the digital to them, and its sort of infrastructural sort of purpose in their social world, and their own sense of their own rights to certain kinds of experiences when they're online.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think we should be thinking, much more broadly about the ecosystem that we all exist in on social media. But I guess if we take it from a public health perspective, that social media, and the evidence is certainly building there, that social media is harmful to kids. So we do ban or protect kids from all sorts of things. I've mentioned driving before, but there's alcohol, there's smoking. And we put in place rules that say you can't access as a child these things until you're a particular age. And in many ways, I guess the social media could be envisaged in a similar sort of system as well.
Yeah, I don't...
Fight. Just fight.
No, well, I don't have the same...
I think it's a bit of both, right? Yeah.
It's a little bit of both. I don't have the same strong view that it's addictive or harmful in that sort of sense, because I guess, as you said, that the evidence is sort of it's not like there's something addictive about the technology itself. It's to do with the broader social context of the way people use it, the sorts of experiences they have with it. And there's this kind of balancing always with young people, but with us, between risk and pleasure that has to go on here, or risk and benefit. And I think that more broadly, the kind of story of childhoods over the last several decades has been to increasingly kind of create, safety protocols and supervision around childhoods, and they become much less risk averse. And so you're seeing people, young people that take less risks, they drink less, they smoke less, blah, blah, blah. They also keep reporting that they're unhappier and they're less resilient. And so it's how do we kind of arrive at a position here that doesn't try to contain and control every aspect of our kids' lives, while sort of recognizing that when it comes to social media, I'm less concerned about, say, whether the technology itself is addictive, and more concerned about the fact that these are extremely powerful commercial entities who don't have our kids' interests at heart, And it's but we could tell them to. We did that with television. We could do it again with social media. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I'll push back a little bit on the addictive thing, because I guess the nature of the technology is to keep us in there. Right, that's what they try to do. These big tech companies, right? So, and they're very good at doing that.
Yeah.
And when you've got an adolescent or a preteen whose brain is still developing, they just don't have the self-regulatory capacity to manage that. But also, they're in a developmental period where they're incredibly interested in what other people have to say and what peers have to say. And when those two things collide, it does make that technology so much more attractive and important to them. Now, I'm not saying, so that issue of risk, that's why I said before, I think the important thing is about balance, right? So if you have a bit of social media, a bit of screen time, plus all those other things that kids need in their development, great. But if you're spending 10 hours a day on your devices, that's 10 hours a day you're not talking to other people. You're not out being physically active. You're not doing all those other things that are developmentally important for kids.
Yeah, I think that the distinction that I really want to keep in mind here is that, like, the reason, say, the technology is tuned like that algorithmically to kind of, scoop up as much of people's attention as possible is because of the underlying commercial imperatives. Yeah. Like the algorithmic models, they don't have to be like that. No. They're like that because of the sort of unchecked commercial interests of the platforms. And so I think that's kind of what we need to do, is to kind of work out, how do we impose a duty, on platforms to basically tune their models differently to create the kinds of cultural environments that are good for our kids.
For all of us.
And all of us, yeah. But also to sort of try to think our way through the image of the young person on, the short video platform for hours and hours a day mindlessly. And I kind of say, that's one sense of what our kids' experiences of social media are like. But then there's this other version of it as well, which is our kids being super creative and chatting with each other and exploring their own identities and learning to represent themselves and all of those, and all those things are going on. It's a very kind of complicated picture. And it is one of the central places where our kids kind of explore and figure out who they are. And if we take this one away as well, then where next, for many of them?
Just building on that point, I think, I've been watching the news coverage really closely over the last couple of days or whatever, and I can say that, just building on your point, because the big tech companies barely get a mention. Right. So there's a real silence that runs through the coverage of this. And I think that is a cause for concern and a bit confusing, because clearly they're the ones responsible and we need to hold them, and but that accountability and responsibility aspect doesn't seem to be a part of the narrative.
No, and it's kind of pushing it out into families and parents and kids to sort of, that's where the point of responsibility is. And I think we'd be much better off in the long term. Well, eventually we're going to have to reckon with these companies themselves,
No, I was going to say, how would you like that to be, what would you like to have in the conversation that's not there?
Just basically the notion that, it also is very much a current moment in time, right? Where it's if you look back 5 years, you look back 10 years, or you used the example before of a television, and how, that was introduced and then there was regulation. People need to see it as part of a wider sociocultural picture, I think, to make it any effort around ahistoricism and or putting onto the family or the child, which seems to be largely the media narrative at the particular moment, I think it is problematic.
I would just like to break in here for just a moment to remind you, if you're watching, that we will be taking your questions. You can use the Q&A tab wherever you're watching us, on a screen presumably, that you can ask your questions. I've got some time saved up at the end to put to the panellists. As you can see, they've got plenty to say. So make sure you chuck your questions in that Q&A box that will come to very soon. Alina, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's interesting because the narrative that I kind of sense with the social media ban is that it's actually put the onus more back onto the social media companies and onto government rather than on parents. Because until now, it's been entirely a parent's and a family's responsibility to figure out how to monitor, how to model, how to limit it. Whereas now that is going back to, effectively the social media company, because it is, the eSafety Commission. Now, is it going to be perfect? Probably not. Is it going to introduce some extra conflicts into families? Quite possibly. But to me, it does feel like it's pulling back some of that responsibility away from
Do you feel like
parents.
partly because it sets a norm?
It sets a norm, yeah. It sets a
parent can
norm
say,
that we as a
yeah,
community are
right.
saying this is something that we need to do something about, that we need to protect our kids from. And while I absolutely think that it should be in the ball of the social media, I don't agree, I don't disagree with that at all.
Like here, I think we totally agree, because I think this is really, if you could say there's something important going on here, it's, for a long time we thought these platforms were too powerful. Here we are all in our own families and homes trying to figure out what to do about it. Like, this idea that actually, collectively, as a culture, as a society, we can say, actually, these are our views about this, these are our values, these are our rules. Like, this is a good moment to get to along a much longer path.
Absolutely. There's lots of other things we need to do, and it's not going to be perfect, I can't imagine. Kids are going to be creative. But.
Do you think if we were to fast forward like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, like, would you think that if you were to log on to social media for anyone, it would come up with like a potential harm thing? The way if you buy cigarettes, it comes up as a potential harm thing. I'm just asking the question.
What the graphic kind of labeling would look like.
But like when you would like put on a television, well, still when you put on a television show, it tells you the rating of the show, like the government-approved rating of this thing, So it's like not such an unusual way to think about our media environments. And it is kind of weird that we've created this media environment, like having put so much effort into the 20th century of like a sense of what our norms and values and standards were around media content, that we just let this like complete free-for-all happen. And that you can have platforms like YouTube or TikTok where our kids can see anything. And there's not even a warning, or not even a classification
totally
of what it is
the
we're seeing.
wild west.
So this is, something crazy has happened here in the last 20 years. I think.
But there was a brief period where the social media companies were putting warnings around misinformation, right?
Yes.
You got to something and there'd be a little, warning. I think that's gone
And
altogether.
as the political culture in the US shifted, they backed right away from
exactly.
that. Yeah.
But so it's possible. I mean, that's on the way to that sense of a warning, isn't it?
Yeah.
I do want to look forward a bit. I want to look forward to what our social media experience might look like in the short term, but also we spoke before about like what data we want. What's the world going to be watching for? Australia being so-called world leading here, are we likely to see other countries follow suit? What sort of metrics would you like to see, Alina? Like, what are you curious to observe over the next year or so?
Well, I think there's the big picture metrics around things like mental health, well-being, academic outcomes. But I'd also really like to hear the voices of kids and families, and in terms of what their perception has been, how it's changed or not their lives, what's working, what's not working, so that we can really build on then and try to determine what those next steps would be.
I reckon one of the things the world is really watching is when a relatively small market like Australia imposes rules like this, do the platforms follow the rules or do they leave the market? Because in other parts of the world, like around, say, bringing in, quotas around news, like what Facebook did in Canada is it left the market, and the platforms threatened to do that in Australia around the News Media Bargaining Code. And so what's interesting to hear so far is the platforms have kind of indicated that on December 10, they're going to stay in the market and follow the rules. And I think a lot of jurisdictions around the world are like, that's interesting. There's a shift here where if we set rules in a national market, they'll follow them, And that could then, then you might see much more appetite from states all over the world to do all sorts of things. And that could be quite interesting.
Interesting. Good word. What about you, Gar?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question to consider. I definitely agree with you that I think we really need to hear from families and young people at the Talkbase. And I'm not always, in the lead up to the actual ban itself, it was a common critique that young people were not as consulted as they could have been throughout the process. But now that it's here and it's like on our front doorstep, literally, I think I'd really like to see the voice of young people and their reactions, and I would like to see that captured in a really persuasive way. I think also there's a really important role particularly for young people in educating other young people around e-safety education stuff, because when it comes from an adult, it can obviously carry a very specific connotation around this. And I think that's a particularly untapped potential. And I think we have a specifically really good moment in time where we can capture the before and after, and you can get young people commenting on it. You can feed that back into making really captivating resources and curriculum resources in schools.
Nick, there's something that you've written about for UQ Contact. Go read the article on the UQ Contact website as well. It's quite a good read, about the fact that this generation of kids who are still under 16 haven't had an easy run so far. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, I worry that we're underrating what a significant disruption this is going to be to their social lives. And, and the thing I've been thinking about a lot is COVID happened in their childhood already. And in different cities in Australia, that was just an enormously disruptive thing to their lives and well-being. And I think we know that now a few years later, that kids paid an enormous price for keeping older Australians safe during the pandemic, and it really affected their social worlds, their mental health, their well-being, their social networks. And now, 5 years later, we're gonna foist on them another huge disruption to their social networks, and I'm not sure we've really thought about how ready we are or how ready they are for that. And we're kind of asking them to be super resilient in a way. There's many things we're trying to protect them from, but there's a lot of social connection that happens through social media. And to disrupt that all again is going to be, some kids are really going to feel the impact of that.
Lynn, how do you think they're going to respond?
Yeah, look, and I think that's where the role of parents and families is really critical, about helping kids find different ways to connect. I mean, we've done it before. It's not like we don't have knowledge about how to do it, but kids will need to find other avenues, presumably, to make those connections, whether online and online platforms or in other ways.
Garth, where are they going to go?
Well, I was going to build on that actually, in the notion that I think, parents, the thing about COVID is that it just came upon us, but this has had quite a long lead up time. And I think parents and communities have probably taken measures to, hopefully, building on Nick's point, to get measures in place to support young people through it. I used the term withdrawal before, which I don't know if that's the right wording. I don't know if I agree with that wording, but clearly it's a big change in their life worlds.
And I just feel like to go to the conversation we're just having about the need for young people's voices to be much more present in these decisions about what we do to them and their lives and their digital worlds, and what better versions of this look like. I just think we don't know how. We don't know enough about how socially important these forms of media are in their lives.
To pick up on that though, is I think we've spent some time sort of pathologizing aspects of social media, and perhaps rightfully so, but we would not. Youth advocacy particularly has been really embellished and heightened via access to social media platforms. Whether the young people are consuming it or they're actually engaging as content creators in it, this is a very specific phenomenon that we've seen. And depending on how the ban goes and the restrictions go, it might be putting it back in the box. Do you know what I mean? A little bit, and we might feel a sense of loss. In terms of youth activism. I don't know if Greta Thunberg would be as famous today if it wasn't for Instagram and her access to, that's just one example, but there's hundreds of examples in around it. I'm sure there are other things that we'll lose through this process.
Yeah. Elena, did you have something you wanted to say there, or you just...
No, in some ways I agree, but I think what we don't have a good sense of is to what extent that applies to how many kids, right? Because yes, I'm sure there are kids who are using social media platforms in a really interesting and creative way. And then there's probably a whole bunch of other kids who are just sitting there consuming content without thought, potentially being exposed to problematic things. And this is the dilemma with social media. Yeah. And if you're talking again from a public health perspective, you're trying to protect all of the population, and particularly those who might be vulnerable, and that's the issue around how do we strike that balance between protecting those who might be particularly vulnerable versus allowing those opportunities as well.
And there's kind of like a contest here that it's hard to think of a historical example where you have a kind of collision between public health imperatives and values and public culture. Do you know what I mean? As in, you can think of social media as harmful to people's health. At the same time, you can understand it as kind of where public life happens for young people. And do you know, to my mind, that public health has thought about that a little bit with, say, respect to like nightlife precincts. They're important cultural places of socialisation, but there's lots of harms and risks in them. Do you know? And nightlife precincts have been really complicated. How to get the balance right? Do you know? And I think this is like one of those sort of problems all over again. And it's hard for us to get the balance right. I think
And the scale of it too. The fact that it's most kids and adolescents, it's most adults, and for a lot of their day they're doing that. So.
Yeah, I mean, also within that, I mean, we are talking about young people a percentage of young people who do not know a time before,
right?
This
is public life to them.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm just trying to put myself in their shoes, if that makes sense, it's going to be a very different world.
Like it'd be like the government switching off television for us. Do you know what I mean? Like it would be experienced as just a huge disruption to how you understand the world you live in. Like so I think it's, yeah.
Well, I did promise that we'd get to your questions tonight, and I've got a stack here, so I'm going to try to barrel through as many as we can. The first question is a sort of procedural one. Brenda's saying, what happens if kids lie about their age? How would the platform check on that?
Well, the platform only has to take reasonable steps to assure their age. So if a kid buys a silicon mask of an old man and puts it on their head and logs in on December 11, like you know what I mean? Like this is why the ban is going to be kind of leaky. Yeah.
But like if they did put a rubber mask on, they'd get onto Instagram?
Yeah, because if say it's a platform that's using like a sort of age assurance technology that like scans your face and makes an estimation about how old you are. That could work. And so then it will be about the eSafety Commission saying, is this a reasonable age assurance process this platform has if, say, every kid can game it in this way? So I think these are all the things we're about to discover. But I think the important point is for families and their kids to know is like this is on the platforms. If your kids are lying and getting on social media accounts, they're not going to be in trouble, and neither they should be. Do you know? Except maybe at home.
Just like saying out of that point, and doesn't quite answer the question, but just like there has been stuff in the media that suggests that parents feel a confidence, like a newfound confidence with having this ban come in, that, in some ways, the legalities of it and all those situations, so shifting away from the notion of implementation, which will be messy, obviously. Parents, obviously it's incredibly popular, but having that confidence behind them. Do you know what I mean?
A question from Tatiana saying, how do you recommend parents make a change for children that might have been on social media already? Cold turkey or little by little? Alina?
Probably makes sense to do it as a process. So rather than switch things off when the ban comes in, to create opportunities for kids to engage in some other way. So they establish routines beforehand.
And I think talk to your kids about what aspects of their digital worlds are important to them might they be able to maintain in other ways. So if they like chatting to these friends and you think that's a good idea and a good part of their lives, where might they be able to continue doing that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think these are important conversations to have.
Someone's saying, I'm all for holding the tech companies accountable, but is Australia able to do that if the US is unwilling?
I think that's what we're about to find out. And that's why countries all over the world are so interested. Like when we set rules, are they going to follow them? And how aggressive is the US going to be from a trade point of view potentially? Like this is what makes it super interesting from a kind of, global capital geopolitics kind of point of view. Yeah.
Question from Raylene, why is it a hard line being set? What about the kids that are a couple weeks, months or days even away from 16?
Well, in some ways you've got to draw the line somewhere. It's the same way with alcohol or driving. There's a hard line. Now, is it perfect? Again, it's probably not, but you've got to draw the line somewhere.
Did you want to add to that?
No, it's a great question.
So this one, I think, really strikes at the heart of some of the things we talked about. It still concerns me that we have not been able to make social media safe for children. Is this measure enough to prevent grooming, for instance? Don't all rush at once.
No, not enough to prevent. But I think that something like grooming, what you need is a young person to have an account where they're able to chat and interact with strangers, And I think the ban will make it much more difficult for that to happen. You know, like you'll still be able to get on TikTok or YouTube in a logged out state and access that algorithmic feed in the same way you always could. That's not going to go away for a lot of young people, but having an account interacting with people, that's the part that's going away. The like access to the algorithmic feeds of content, that's not going away at all. And I think that'll be another kind of big surprise for people. So I think, you know, interacting with strangers on the internet will become much more difficult on these platforms than it has been, but we'll have to keep our eye on places like Roblox and whatever, you know.
I'm interested to talk a bit more about this sense of making social media safe for children. Have we missed a trick here? Have we missed an opportunity to approach this problem from a different direction?
I think, to reiterate my previous point about including the voice of young people in the actual development of the legislation, I think is really important to consider. I know there has been some efforts around it, but the efforts could have been much more substantial and much more involved around that. And also a more, perhaps, an inclusive intake of young people that really sort of respects the fact that they come from a variety of different cultural backgrounds, and that's a contributing factor too.
Alina?
I guess the question really is, you know, who can actually implement this, right? So this is a government policy that puts the onus onto the social media companies. So if we were talking about making the platform safer for children somehow, which I think is a really important and very worthwhile cause for not just kids but for everyone, then the government would still have to somehow legislate for that to happen. I think that's probably harder and more complicated than just putting a ban into place. So I would see this hopefully as just the first step, and the next step is to consider, well, how do we make this work as a safe place?
Nick?
Yeah, I agree. Like there's sort of, in a way, asking the platforms to comply with the ban in the way that it's written is kind of a reasonably straightforward thing for them to do. And from a commercial point of view, they're thinking, oh, well, we lose, you know, access to this little part of the market. Like in terms of the business model, the numbers still add up to stay in this market. You know, like to do that hard work of saying, this is what safe environments look like. This is what our expectations are for you to stay in this market. That's a much tougher conversation to have with them, and you would probably encounter much more resistance. But I think eventually we're going to have to go there. Yeah.
A couple more kind of technical questions. Pottsville Preschool is asking, would a parent account but designated to child athlete profile, would that account be banned? I think this really is a question about kids who have an online presence for professional reasons and what that means for them. What do we know here?
This kind of an account wouldn't be banned. It's owned by the parent, and they're the owner of it, and they verify their age, and then the content is their kid doing all sorts of things. That's going to be fine. And I think what's going to be really interesting about Australia's social media culture and creator economy is we're going to see way more of these kinds of accounts actually that are kind of owned by a parent but used by a child. This is going to become very common in Australia in the short video creator economy probably, but also just in terms of social networks. There'll be these really interesting kind of networks, I think, of like, you know, I mean, I was sort of thinking when I was a teenager, I used my dad's email address because I didn't have one. You know, but, you know, like, do you know, it's like
Mr. Carrot.
yeah. And I was like, you know, on all sorts of email lists all over the internet, you know, doing all sorts of things under his name. So, you know, like I think that's what's going to happen in a lot of cases. You know, you'll have kids doing all sorts of things on parent-owned accounts.
But is that a bad thing? I'm thinking about using the home phone to call your friends.
Exactly. Yeah.
Alina, I'm interested to hear your take. Like, there's a measure of parental surveillance that's possible when you share a password.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it enables parental monitoring in a much more effective way if you are both have access to that platform. So the parent can monitor what's there, they can monitor communications to the child. Now, obviously, if the parent then hands it over entirely and the child is responsible and the parent, then it defeats the purpose of the ban. But if they're using it together, that's actually a really positive step potentially.
And also within that, I mean, we're going to have, and this hasn't been part of the coverage really that much, is you're going to have parents that want to follow the letter of the law, and then you're going to have parents that are more carefree in their approach to these sort of things. And I think that is going to potentially cause some tensions and conflict, so at least in the first couple of months, And then once everyone gets sort of into a rhythm, perhaps not so much.
Yeah, you can have parents who'll just log themselves into their kid's device and leave them to it. Do you know? Yeah. So yeah, like, and there's no, a parent is allowed to do that, I think, under the ban.
And I think kids are already doing that anyway. There's a lot of that kind of family sharing, and that's got its problems in itself, as if it's not monitored in any way. But if it's monitored and if it's being done together, then that opens up opportunities for conversation about safe use, about responsible use, all of those sorts of things.
Another thing we've gestured at a couple of times is the fact that kids are really creative and especially teenagers love being told what not to do. What do you think might happen? Where do you think kids might go?
But like, I feel like I'd be explaining to kids like what you should do is like,
What you need to do, kids, is get a VPN, put on a latex mask. Okay. Have a punt. Like, the analogy that I've heard is like, we've closed the doors to the pool, kids are going to go swim in the river. What's the river? Like, where should we be looking if we're concerned parents and educators to make sure that we're in step with where our kids might be looking for this kind of connection?
like if you sort of think about it as two bits of the puzzle, like what do kids love to do on social media? They love to get like immersed in these algorithmic feeds of video, and they love to like follow and connect with and chat to their friends and other people they're interested in. I think the algorithmic feeds of video stuff, that probably won't change for many kids. They'll just use YouTube and TikTok in a logged out state and they'll keep on going, do you know? And then the other bit about how to connect with their friends, like what do? Will they have a whole bunch of new WhatsApp groups and they'll be in WhatsApp and they'll be like copying links from TikTok across to WhatsApp and chatting about it there? And will they end up in like way bigger WhatsApp groups than they ever were in before, because that what used to be a social network on Instagram or TikTok is now a group with hundreds and hundreds of kids in it sharing all sorts of things. Like, these are the sorts of things that will start to happen really rapidly. In our group, we were laughing about kids, starting to use the chat. Like, in schools, you have this thing where kids use the chat feature of Google Docs. Do you know? Like, will Google Docs become like the new social
The nerdiest feature I can imagine.
But like, you could paste all sorts of stuff into the doc and chat and like I think like any platform is, because when we realize these features are built into the internet all over the place,
I'm thinking about like 90s chat rooms, right? Where you're
like,
what's the shrugging emoji? Like, you have to like dust off all your old emoticons and stuff. Look, we only have a couple of minutes left. What I'm really curious to hear from each of you is what you hope a parent or an educator can, like, what's a piece of advice that someone can be empowered to do or empowered to think about from this? And you get two things. What you hope the government or tech companies will keep in mind when we're navigating this new world come the 11th of December. So a piece of advice for a parent or an educator, and a throwdown for either a government or a tech company. Nick?
I think for parents and educators, like, have you ever talked to kids about their ideal version of the internet? Like, what would they like their digital worlds to look like? And then if they start telling you X, Y, and Z, then it's like, well, how can I help you kind of construct a digital world that functions like that? Do you know? How can I help you creatively explore it? All of those things. Like, I think that's, a moment like this requires to have those kind of conversations with our kids, not just arguments about, what they're doing. What's the second question?
A throwdown. A throwdown.
A throwdown?
For a government or tech company.
Like, what should they do?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think, what I'd like the government to think is, okay, we've taken one step. Now the hard work begins. Like, what does it mean to imagine and say, here's a positive duty of care that platforms and digital services have to our children? That's the real task.
Alina?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be particularly novel and creative here based on what you've said. I think, to me, it's about having those conversations. So continuing the conversation about what are kids doing now and what are they doing afterwards. Because that's not only just about social media and connection, but what are they doing in other spaces? So, if they are having concerns, how does that translate into what the parent can do to support them? If they're suddenly getting those withdrawal symptoms, how can the parent help them through that? As for what can the government and the companies do, I think it's really building on this, not just leaving it at the ban, but working through what are the next steps, what are the next things that we can do to support kids and families, and to create those safe spaces for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, just building on that, I think it's it's productive conversations, plural, right? So it's multiple conversations over multiple times, and depending on where the child is in terms of their developmental stage, the conversation might shift and alter over time, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And then for like the final point in and around the ban, the throwdown, is that how you said there? I think the most important thing is I would really want the Australian public to remain very hopeful and not to let cynicism sort of like, yes, there will be teething issues. Everyone understands that going forward. You know, Anthony Albanese has said there will be teething issues. So I think to roll with it as it goes, but then also hopefully to feel empowered going forward in regards to it. And I think every Australian citizen should feel empowered around this. This is a really important thing. And obviously, yeah, that's all I have to say.
Well, that's perfect because that's all we have time for tonight. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Garth, Alina and Nick, for joining me in the studio, sharing your expertise with us. Tonight was our last UQ Talks event for 2025. So thank you to everyone who's tuned in online or joined us in person for one of these talks throughout the year. Looking forward to sharing more in-depth conversations with you about the topics that matter in UQ Talks in 2026. But until then, good night.